First and foremost, I want to apologize sincerely for not being able to be there with you in person, but I want to talk about the importance and the real uniqueness of this work that we did last year. And I want to give first some backdrop about how it came to be. I got a call from Beth saying that she was looking for someone to help them really think critically about some of the challenges that they were having around their African American students, and not just with regard to academic outcomes, but also and really around issues tied to discipline. I frequently get lots of people who will call and say we're having challenges, we're having issues, but it's typically on the broad sense, can you come in and talk to us? Can you come in and kind of, try to inspire or motivate your teachers? And I think that kind of has a limited, really type of an impact. But what I appreciated about Beth and the leadership here was the fact that we had a group of leaders who were willing to say, we've got some data, we want to look at the data, and we really want to just have some hard types of conversations with our staff. Rarely do I get those kinds of calls where you have a school leader who says, I want to have hard conversations with my staff. So to me that was really refreshing on the one hand, curious on the other hand, and really inviting me to do that was something I was somewhat willing to do, because you typically don't have school leaders who are in the mode of saying, help me push my staff. It's oftentimes framed around this idea of what my students don't have, what my students are lacking, and kind of operates from this deficit paradigm. So I just appreciated the fact that there was a different framework about how this work was going to unfold around helping us to think and talk and really kind of dig deep into what we're seeing with the discipline data along racial and ethnic lines. So from there, what I have to say is that, what made this situation different was that the entire leadership team was clear about the fact that, look, we've got data, and the data is not pretty, and the data is inexcusable, and we've got to start thinking about this, and not just in a one-shot deal, but we want a series of meetings. And that's what really made this unique, is that there was a way to have this be a series of conversations that were all going to be data-driven. Now, again, I'm fortunate to spend a lot of time in schools, talking with staffs and talking with leadership teams, but rarely do I see principals saying, here's data from our school that is disaggregated by race and ethnicity, in particular to discipline, because we can talk about learning outcomes, we can talk about academic kinds of standards, but we can't get to that if discipline and management issues are as rampant as they are in some schools. So that's why I appreciated the fact that we were willing to have these conversations around discipline. Part of what we saw here was the fact that we had a small African American population, like we see in lots of schools across the district, across the country, but yet they were very disproportionate in terms of who was being disciplined, who was being referred to the office. And so this is something that lots of schools see and don't really begin to probe into why they see it, and don't begin to say, what can we do to begin to disrupt these kinds of approaches. So the idea that we were going to use each of these sessions, these 4 or 5 or I think 6 sessions around data, around having the staff dissect the data, having the staff talk about the data, having the staff begin to sort of look at themselves, was a very different approach than what you see in most schools. Oftentimes when I go to other schools, the conversation is so steeped in what students don't have, what students are lacking, what parents don't have, what parents are lacking. And so it becomes a vent session, becomes a blame game session, and at the end of the day you spend an hour or 2 hours and you really haven't sort of moved in any direction differently than where you were when you first started the conversation. This felt different from the outset because I think the staff was open, I think they had been prepped, I think that helped, the fact that you had a leadership team who was saying, look, staff, we've got a lot of challenges, but we can be better. And I don't think it was a situation where leadership blamed the staff for this wholeheartedly, but I think the way that it was presented seemed to be that, look, staff, we may be playing a role in why we're seeing what we're seeing. I think that just is much more palatable to staff, as opposed to creating these opposites. Either it's all on the parents or it's all on the teachers. These are real complex and complicated issues, as we all know, and there's no one set solution because there's no one set cause to the problem. But I think we have to focus on what it is that we can control, and I think this work was important because we can't control what parents do. We can't control what happens at home, but what we can control is what happens in our school sites, and that's why I applaud what happened here at Environmental, because it was about talking about what we could do here in our classrooms and in our schools. Each session, we got into conversations, we got into topics, and we looked at data and looked at who was being referred, And it was not a situation that's always easy to do. And I would also applaud the leadership. And I'm not just saying this because I work with these ladies and I think they're phenomenal. I'm saying this in all sincerity because I think it takes some vulnerability to even have an outsider come into your school to help you look at these data. You take a risk when you say, look, we're not as good as we want to be. We want someone from the outside to come in and help us to think about how we can be better. I could have come in and said, look, you're awful, you're terrible, and you're going to always be awful and terrible. But it was not about that. It was just the approach of saying, how do we begin to look at the data that was not very positive. But they recognized that it was not positive. They didn't try to explain it away. They didn't try to justify it in some way. They said, look, we got to be better. And I appreciate their stance and their kind of hard line to say this is just unacceptable. And so from there we had a series of meetings. And I think more of what schools should be thinking about doing is taking data, grade level data, classroom data, subject area data, and putting it in front of teachers and saying, look, here's where we are. Let's begin to talk about why we see what we see. What role might we be playing? And not letting teachers fall back on that same sort of, tired kind of explanation. The kids are bad, the kids are needy, the kids lack. I mean, at some point in time, we all can agree that that's a real issue, that the kids have challenges, but we also have to be frank about what is it that we can do as educators that may either help to disrupt some of those challenges or that we may do things that only reinforce them. So using data in real time from the school, looking at year-over-year data, that's what was also important about this, where we looked at data from one year to the next and really began to see where some areas had gotten better, where some areas had gotten worse. And again, this was not about teacher bashing, this was not about teacher blaming, this was not about pointing the finger at particular teachers, but it was looking at, look, what can we do as a school to begin to think about this work more collectively? What supports do you need? What strategies might you offer? And we get engaged in a series of activities. I think our first session we spent time kind of doing some relationship building, some rapport building. We had them talk about their own sets of personal and lived experiences. So we started with the self and had them begin to think about what it was that made a difference in their lives, right? Because many of them grew up with some challenging circumstances. And I think it's always important for teachers to start with their own challenges, to realize that somehow somebody didn't blame their families or didn't blame them. They tried to help to fortify their social emotional development along with their academic development, and that makes a difference. So from there we kind of started to move into the data, and I thought the data conversations were oftentimes uncomfortable. The data conversations were sometimes hard to kind of really get to the point where they need to be gotten to, but that's why subsequent conversations were important, because we could pick up where we left off. These weren't one-time conversations, and I think some teachers felt a little bit uncomfortable, but that's oftentimes needed for teachers to begin to be reflective about their own practice. And I have to again give the leadership team really credit, because I always thought that in many ways they have like a good cop, bad cop approach. Danielle pushes, and I think she pushes from the standpoint where she's really not going to let folks off the hook. It's almost like a good cop, bad cop. I would watch Beth try to explain things, and I would watch Danielle's facial features, and her face sometimes would just convey, we're not going to just stop at this. We're going to go a little bit deeper, and all those kinds of conversations helped, right? And I don't know what would happen when I would leave here in terms of how staff felt, but at least there was a series of conversations happening amongst the staff, with staff and leadership. And I think those are the kinds of conversations we need to have in schools across this country, where we're talking about why we see racial disparities with discipline, and then you can move that into why we see racial disparities with academic outcomes. Right now the conversations are just not happening in an honest and thoughtful way, and I think that oftentimes contributes to the problem.